When looking at Reconstruction in the New South, we see the various new opportunities for African American women, and we see the different ways that freedom is really expressed to the newly freed African Americans. And freedom meant different things for each person. It meant reuniting family, changing names, building schools, churches, free life, dressing the way they wanted to, women being able to buy clothes and dress in really bright, vibrant colors that were never given to them or available to them before. These are all some of the expressions that we see from the newly freed people. Marriage and family particularly were some of the first areas that African Americans displayed their freedom. Many got married legally. We actually see men demonstrating a level of paternalism, patriarchy, however you want to call it, over their wives, which they never really had before when they were slaves, because their master was their owner. And a lot of men in the early years after the Civil War ended didn't want their wives to work, right? That was a way of maybe participating in these kind of Victorian ideals about the proper sphere of women and men. But many marriages and families were reunited. Children, especially who had been sold off during slavery, were reunited with their parents with the help of the Freedmen's Bureau, which was a federal agency dedicated solely to helping the newly freed people get established and ingrained in society, setting them up with a job, making sure they had proper health care, place to live, helping with setting up schools, right? Education was a huge part of the new freedom that African Americans experienced, and many families insisted that their children be schooled. And so the Freedmen's Bureau helped to set up schools and particularly bring in teachers from the North to help educate. We see the establishment of historically Black colleges during the Reconstruction era. Spelman College, which was an all-women's African American school, and Howard University in Atlanta come about during the Reconstruction era. We also see the importance of the church. Women really were instrumental to holding the community together, and the church itself was a pillar in the African American community. You think about it, for these people who had been enslaved their whole lives, their grandparents, their great-grandparents, generations of captivity, to witness the end of that and to finally get what they had been praying for all their lives, which was freedom, for that to happen, we see that religion and faith was a huge part of the African American community in the South, especially. With regards to club and reform, we see, especially more in that middle class African American community that really is small in comparison to the white middle class in the North, but the middle class that does exist, women, African American women, were highly involved in club work and reform work. One of the leading reformers pictured here with her family was Ida B. Wells, who launched one of the greatest reform movements in this era against lynchings in the South. And this kind of reform work, went beyond the violence inflicted upon the African American community. They also sought reform for schools, for the community, enhancing the community. So reform work becomes instrumental for African American women that are seeking change as well. They may not have the vote, but they can be influential in other ways. Old constraints for African American women, we see that really there are still limited job opportunities available. Most African Americans in the South end up as sharecroppers, which means they often are working for their old masters, renting land and giving a portion of their crop to their owners as payment, and then helping their tenant, or as their tenant, helping their landlord manage the farm, the plantation. So in some ways, it's a neo form of slavery, that they don't have their own land, and the government never does anything to allow them to have their own land. There really were few opportunities beyond agriculturalism in the South, right? The South does not have the same economic variety and industrialism as the North. So women worked in agriculturalism, domestic service, and even though maybe some women didn't work immediately following the Civil War, many were forced to work in the coming years because the South was so poor and African Americans were making so little money that it forced everyone to contribute to the family's economy. We also see the beginning of a new form of social terrorism in the South with the formation of the KKK in the years that followed the Civil War. This was a way of really trying to reinforce these social racial hierarchies that had been dismantled as a result of slavery being abolished. And the Ku Klux Klan, used social forms of terrorism like lynchings and burnings and scare tactics to try to reinstate white superiority. We also see during this time the establishment legally and socially of Jim Crow, which was the racial separation from whites and blacks via the schools, restaurants, train cars, buses, as time goes on. This is a photograph of women, African American women, doing laundry, and this was actually one of the more coveted jobs for African American women because it provided greater autonomy. They could take laundry from somebody's house, bring it back to their house, or and work communally, talking, gossiping, whatever it may be, complaining while they did their work, and they could do it in their own time without having direct supervision, as if they were domestic workers working in some white person's house. For working women in the North, industrialization continued to bring about new job opportunities, particularly in the textile industry for unskilled young workers. Textile mills tended to be seen as an extension of women's work, right? Oh, they're working it with textiles. Well, that's what they did in the home. Therefore, working in a clothing factory would be seen as, possibly mildly more feminine than some other kind of industry. But this continued to be especially an opportunity for young and married women, to earn some money, help their families, especially for immigrant young women. They were providing supplemental income. And that is why a lot of owners would pay them a third of what they paid men. Because again, there's this Victorian model that is stating that women are supposed to be at home. Men are supposed to be the breadwinners. So if women are working, well, they're just helping out the family's income. They're not the sole providers, which we know is not true. There was plenty of single mothers working and trying to support their families on a third of what men were being paid. We also see by the 1870s greater professional, what you would think of as white collar jobs becoming available for women as typists, secretary work as we probably would see it during that time. With the technology of the typewriter, these typists could work in these businesses, which were somewhat glamorous, right? Women's magazines at the time would, highlight stories about women who would work for their boss and fall in love and get married. And this was, again, seen as sort of a segue for young women to temporarily work, have a little bit of independence before they went on to get married. Again, this was not always the case, but mostly businesses would hire young, white, native-born young women, unmarried women. And as far as unions were concerned, though women were allowed into certain unions like the Knights of Labor, most skilled unions still believed that women were supplemental. They kind of abided by the same Victorian model that women should be in the home, should be mothers. And the fact that they are working in these factories is improper. And so these union maids, as many union men referred to them as, were tolerated at best in the unions. And if anything, they were seen as taking jobs away from, well-deserving men that should be having their jobs instead. And they were given, secretarial or more kind of, again, feminine, domestic, paternal roles within the union, rather than being on the front lines picketing or as active in the unions.